Good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon Eastern time, anyway. Um, Welcome to Take Intel. This is my game design stream. My name is Hamish Cameron. I am Peregrine Kiwi here and on the Twitters. Just checking paranoidly that all of my things are on. And I hear myself on the stream, so it all sounds good. Okay, so I designed this brawl, which is powered by the Apocalypse game, and it's one of the older ones around at this point. And I occasionally get messages from people asking for game design advice or the like, and recently I got one from Olivia, who said, bring it up on my Twitter, which takes me way longer than it should do. Yeah, there we go. Well, let me just advance the slideshow here, actually. Here we go. Said, what should first-time PBTA designers consider when starting a PBTA game powered by the Apocalypse that beginners might not think of? I've definitely had variations on this question before. It's a good question. It's one of those things, like, you don't know what you don't know when you start doing something. And so I don't claim to have all the answers, and this is obviously just my own personal suggestions. And one sort of big piece of meta advice, I would say, is that you should ask a lot of different people and then choose the approach that works for you. I think that's the most important. I'm just going to back the slide up a little bit. I've called this the designer's bloody fingerprints, because there's a lot of... Game design is a good chance for you as the designer to have a sort of direct input into how things happen at the table. And so this is... I don't know, I just chose this as a good title. Maybe I'll have some more profound thoughts about this. Obviously it's a reference to Apocalypse World and Bloody Fingerprints. So yeah, some tips and considerations for your first PBTA game. So when you're a first-time PBTA designer, starting to think about a game, or you've got a game idea, and you just want to be sure that you don't miss anything, really. I think that's part of where questions like this come from. The last thing you want is to almost finish something and find that there was something that you should have considered earlier that you didn't until much later. So for some people, if you're starting designing a PBTA game, this might require a bit of rewinding, and it might be like, oh, I didn't do that. And that's fine. That's totally cool. This is, as I said, this is my advice on the way that I approach new PBTA games. It might not necessarily work for you. Chime in the chat if you have particular questions or or if you disagree with anything for that matter. So I'm going to start off with some sort of game design basics, actually. And these are not specific to Powered by the Apocalypse. These are ultimately derived from a class that I visited at Beloit College a couple of years ago now, visiting a colleague's writing class, where he was talking about games. And there was mostly digital games in that particular case, but I tweeted out and asked my various game designer friends, like, what are some things that you think I should absolutely mention? And this list is distilled from those things that they mentioned. So ideas are cheap, work is hard. Anyone can come up with a good idea for a game. You all have good ideas for games. The trick is finding the time and finding the inclination and finding the sort of spoons, I guess, to push through from your idea to the ultimate thing. The corollary of this is that you should get feedback and don't be afraid to share your ideas. If you don't... Like, the people are always worried about people stealing their ideas. Yeah, sure, but you'll come up with more ideas, and all those ideas are good. People can't steal the work that you put into the design process. I mean, they probably can, but that's like, choose good friends, I guess. But don't, yeah, no, I mean, seriously though, don't be afraid to share your work around. Like, I shared early drafts of the sprawl around. You can still get those PDFs. If you go looking for PDFs in the shady corners of the web, you can find various alphas that I shared. Yeah, That's the way it is. That's sort of archaeology of game design in a way. Like those will exist, but the work, the existence of those early versions doesn't invalidate the work that I did to get it from that version to the final version that people had. I feel like whenever I give this advice, I always end up couching it and then saying something that I think I shouldn't have said. I don't know. At any rate, there are definitely instances of people like stealing work or stealing ideas, but in reality, I think it's more of a fear than a reality. Moving right along, write everything down. This is the Ryan Macklin rule. You will have a lot of good ideas. As soon as you have those good ideas, write them down if you can. Write them down on your phone, write them down on a piece of paper, whatever. If you don't write them down, there's a decent chance you'll forget them and you'll never remember them again, and that sucks, especially when they were really good. I often use the voice recorder on my phone if I'm driving around, and I'll just start rambling to myself. That reminds me actually that I have like a voice recording from a drive the other day that I have to go back and look at. Yeah, find a way of recording your thoughts. And it doesn't matter if you don't use them all. They might not all be applicable to the game you have. You might mix and match a lot. This is something that a lot of designers talk about. They'll have files full of game ideas and they won't necessarily go anywhere, but later on they might. Like in a few years' time, that cool idea you had about using cards to measure like blood loss might actually work for some other thing you're doing, even if it doesn't work for your Jane Austen game. Iterate. Like all of this, and this is probably the most important thing, it's not like you'll do this step and then you're done with it and you never consider it again. You'll always be going back to this stuff. So even if you've sort of passed the point where most of this advice is useful, you might go back and revisit things and think about them in the light of what I've said and decide whether you agree or not. There's a constant cycle of iteration, constant process of iteration. Something that is really hard often, especially with the first game, is trying to put in too much. This is especially important for board games, but it also applies to role-playing games as well. There's a idiom, and certainly in board gaming, but role-playing to a certain extent, that your game will do one thing well. So find out what that one thing is and make sure you focus on that. Now that one thing can be quite broad. I think a lot of people agree that for the Sprawl, the one thing is cyberpunk heist games, and it does that really well. Once you start to go outside that, the systems aren't designed for that, because I designed it to do that one thing. So work out what your one thing is. It might be something broad, like a genre like that. It might be something very specific. Games can be very big, games can be very small. That's all okay. Play more games. And play games that are like your game, whether that be in theme or in style. If you're designing in the Powered by the Apocalypse space, play a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games. See what other people are doing, see how they're doing it, see what problems they're coming up with, see how they're solving them. You don't have to do the same thing as them. You won't in every case. Sometimes you might, that's fine. There is a lot of reuse of ideas. There is a lot of stuff in this Brawl that just comes from Apocalypse World or Dungeon World. There is a lot of stuff in other games that comes from the Sprawl. That's totally fine. That's the way it works. But play more games so you have an idea of how they play and you can riff on them as you like. So this is just some basics, essentially. This is stuff that I tell my students when I'm really quickly getting them into the things to think about for game design. It's also very similar to things that I tell my students when I'm getting them to write papers, for that matter. But if you want a lot more advice and a lot more specific advice, I'm just going to slide down here to reveal the edge of the HTML. Check out Nathan Paoletta and Will Hindmarch's Design Games podcast, designgames.simplecast.fm. If you search for Design Games RPG podcast, you will also find it. I'll put it in the show notes as well. They have something like 50 episodes that is full of really interesting game design advice. A lot of it like really specific about mechanics or various things that happen in a game, and a lot of it more general. Highly recommend it. Every time I listen to one of their podcasts, I get a bunch of ideas. So there's a more general sort of place to go. So to get to the main topic that I want to talk about today, that is first time Powered by the Apocalypse designers thinking about where to start, what things they might want to think about. I am only really going to cover three things. I think these are three pretty important things. They're pretty broad, but if you have specific questions about other things, or anyone has suggestions about other things that could be covered, feel free to chime in the chat. Or in the comments when this is on YouTube. This will be up on YouTube very shortly after the stream is done. So the three things are the emcee agenda and principles and moves, player agendas, and the structure of moves. So my first piece of advice is to start with the emcee agenda. So if you've already started and you didn't start with this, then that's fine. It's too late. It's not too late. You can always go back and think about this. So start with the emcee agenda and the principles and the moves, because these will tell you some very important things. And when you are looking at a Powered by the Apocalypse game for the first time, you can tell a lot about the game by looking at these. They should, if they're done well, tell you what the game is about. They should tell you what genre the game is in, and they should tell you something about the tone of the game. And those are pretty critical. They should also tell you what some of the most important features of the genre are. If you don't know what the genre is, you might not necessarily be able to pick up on it if you're not that familiar with, I don't know, say Jane Austen, to use another example that I've already used. There is a Jane Austen Powered by the Apocalypse game. Name is eluding me right now. It's in, it hasn't come out yet, but it was kickstarted recently. I don't know a lot about Jane Austen, but I should be able to read the emcee agenda and know a lot about how the genre works and what important features of the genre are. And if you are designing the game, then you should have a good grasp on these, and you should be able to articulate them in the text to the people who don't necessarily have a good grasp of them. So that if you've never run a zombie game before, and I pick up your zombie game, the agenda and principles should tell me how to run your zombie game. So in the fifth tier, what should the emcee do to establish that at the table? So yeah, how do I actually do that? What are the features and how do I use them? And these 5 points, the first three basically kind of correspond to the agenda. The agenda tells you what the game is about, what the genre is, what's the tone. It might say something about the setting as well, but not necessarily. The principles sort of correspond to 4 and 5. Like, what are the important features of the genre, and what should the emcee do to establish that as at the table? It's also kind of principles, but also kind of moves. The moves are sort of the specific things that the emcee does to reinforce those at a micro level. So if you have this down, and this is why I recommend starting here, if you have this down, then you will have a good idea about like how to explain your game. So yeah, start there. Start with the emcee principle, start with the agenda, and start with the moves. The second thing is to think about player agendas, and this is maybe less obvious, because not all Powered by the Apocalypse games explicitly have player agendas that are called player agendas. There was a recent discussion on the Plus One Forward podcast, which is part of the Gauntlet family, on player principles and agendas. I think it came out on April 6th. They put it right there on the slide. Highly recommend listening to that, because if the emcee has an agenda that tells them how to play the game, or how to run the game, then it makes sense that the players should have an agenda that tells them how to play the game. So what should the players have in mind while they're playing? So why would I go to this? Especially when it's something that not all Powered by the Apocalypse games have. Few reasons. Expectation management. It's good to set expectations so that when somebody picks up the rulebook and they can look at it as a player, they can say, oh, these are the things I should be doing while I'm playing the game. Oh, yeah, that sounds cool. Or I don't want to do that, so I don't want to play this game. That's fine. You want people to who want to play your game to play your game, and if people are not inclined to want to play your game, then you shouldn't necessarily try and get them to play it. People who want to play the thing will have more fun doing it than people who are just kind of doing it because they feel like they have to. Of course, there are times when there are certain games that you should just play. Everyone should play Dog Eat Dog. It's one of the best design games out there. Not Powered by the Apocalypse, but very excellent. So part of that, not just expectation management in terms of getting to the game, but getting on the same page when you're in the group. If everybody who is playing the game wants the same thing out of the game and knows where they are and what they're doing, then it makes the whole thing flow much more easily. If 3 people at the table think they're in for a cyberpunk heist and one person thinks they're in for Looney Tunes, then your game of the Sprawl probably won't work that well. And also, third, because it will be very helpful when you come to write your introductory material. So for that, I'll flick over to here, and I'll show you the player agendas in the Sprawl. Wait, let me... this one, no. Alright, here we go. Here we go. So the Sprawl doesn't have things that are explicitly called player agendas, but it does have a list of why play the Sprawl, which are essentially player agendas. So play the Sprawl if you want to find out what happens in a neon and chrome cyberpunk future. Play the Sprawl if you want to create a story about badass professionals living outside the law. And play the Sprawl if you want to struggle against the man. And play the Sprawl if you want to win sometimes, lose sometimes, and be double-crossed a lot. This one's particularly important because a lot of people don't like well, not a lot of people, but there are some certain vocal people who don't like the fact that at the end of a Sprawl mission, you kind of get screwed a lot, which is exactly how cyberpunk games work in my experience, certainly, and in the experience of a lot of other people. But for some people, that's clearly not the case. But this should tell them, right? If they've read this, then they should know, oh, we're going to win sometimes, we're going to lose sometimes, and we're going to be double-crossed a lot. So play it if that sounds good, and if it doesn't, then don't. And play it expecting that to happen. Right? So this gets into that idea of expectation management, gets into ideas of everybody being on the same page, and this is my intro text. Let me just get that out of the way and flick back to the player agenda page. Okay, so moving on. So I've covered start with the emcee agenda, move on to think about player agendas. You don't necessarily have to put one in it. You definitely should have an emcee agenda. That's part of what makes Apocalypse World work. Player agenda is definitely something you should think about. This is probably a good time to mention the Power 19, which I should have put on here. If you Google Power 19 or 19 questions about game design or something like that, it'll probably come up. It is a list of 19 questions that you as a game designer should be able to answer about your game. It includes things like, what is your game about? How does your system reinforce that? That kind of thing. The emcee agenda and principles and moves is a powerful structure for enforcing that kind of thing, to making sure the person who's running the game knows how the game is supposed to be run in very explicit language. So now we get to the point that a lot of people probably start. They think of some cool moves and think, oh, maybe this could work. How could this work as a move? Yeah, I know. I certainly think of a lot of moves for like random games all the time. Not so much as I used to. Certainly when Powered by the Apocalypse was first around, my friends and I would just constantly be like, when you're standing in line for fried chicken and they run out, roll plus super hungry or something, like whatever. It was sort of like just a internal language of the early 2010s. I don't do that quite so much anymore, but now I actually make the games, I guess. But moves are an important thing to think about, and they can go wrong. or you can get stuck with them, possibly more importantly. So if a move seems... Whoa. Okay, wait a minute. Okay. If a move seems wrong, then it's worth considering the basic structure of moves. Alright, and that is, moves should take you from the fiction into the mechanics and then back into the fiction. The first part is called the trigger, and then the second part is the mechanic, and then the last part sort of leads you back in. But that move trigger is that first fiction. That's something that is pretty important to keep in mind. There are definitely a lot of good examples of where I did this well in the sprawl, and there are a couple of bad examples where the fictional trigger is tricky and hard to see, and sometimes where the outro trigger is hard to see. 99% I would say of questions I have about moves that people have asked me about moves in my games are basically come down to not knowing what the fiction is, or the move maybe not having the best fictional trigger. So this is definitely a thing where you as the designer can smooth out a lot of bumps in play. Man, I do not know why it keeps doing that. I'll just leave it like this. Especially because I was about to go to this anyway, right? So this is sort of summarized in Vincent Baker's Dice and Clouds set on anyway.com, or lumpley.com, I guess, his Anyway blog. Can I zoom in a little bit on this? So this is from while he was thinking about Apocalypse World and designing Apocalypse World. This is, I'll put this in the show notes for sure. This is a set of his thinking about the way that fiction, that's the cloud, relates to the mechanics, that's the dice. Or as I always think of it, boxes and clouds, because of the diagrams. I'll try and find one. Here we go. Right, so this series is basically about how resolution mechanics work, whether they go to dice, whether they just get resolved internally, whether they do both, what happens with the dice inform the fiction, and so on. Right? Take a look through those. There's lots of good stuff in there, lots of good stuff in this blog anyway. But this stuff is particularly useful for thinking about how the fiction mechanic stuff works. Again, I am going to try to put this back into normal. Okay, here we go. Alright. So moves that lead from the fiction and back to the fiction. My notes here. That's ideally what you want. You want all of your moves to smoothly go from the conversation, which is at the heart of Powered by the Apocalypse, to some resolution, and then back into the fiction, so that the mechanics are entirely in service of, and mechanics like whatever the dice roll is, or card draw, or whatever choice in a diceless game, smoothly pushes you back into where the story is going, because the story is what you want. So you want triggers that tell you when in the fiction the move applies, and you want resolution that explicitly has a fictional effect. So you should look at all of your moves with a really critical eye and think about this. Does this move clearly tell me when I am engaging it? Does this move tell me what happens after I've engaged it? What happens after I've rolled the dice and I see the numbers and I get a 10? What is that? What happens, not just mechanically, but what happens in the story, and how do I know? So kind of one of the last things I want to talk about here briefly is the second part of move structure in terms of the numbers, and this is almost getting into MC advice here a little bit. So what is a move about? A move is a sort of mechanical interlude in the conversation that helps drive the story. It should move. It should change things. If the move isn't going to change things, then what is the move doing? That's a question you should ask yourself. Moves interweave in the conversation, and they introduce complication. And this is a pretty important thing to bear in mind. One early thing I do is I think about what the genre I'm trying to model is, and what kinds of complications exist, and then how they get triggered in the narrative. So, for example, in a Mission Impossible movie, what kind of things go wrong? What kind of things do the players do? How do those things interrelate to each other? Do the characters do, and how do they relate with each other? So you think about all that kind of stuff while you're brainstorming ideas. But then in particular, think about what kind of complications and how they're going to get engaged in the fiction. So if you're just using the standard dice spread, and there's no reason not to, essentially, a couple of games have, but I don't know, this dice spread works well for a reason. Once you change the dice spread, you have to think about other things. The normal way, and this is why I say the quick and dirty version, that people will explain this, and I do this myself when I'm running con games, just to really quickly say what's going on to the players who are about to play the game, is that on a 6+, 6-, on a 6-, the MC introduces a complication. On a 7 to 9, the players get to choose their own complication, and on a 10+, you get what you want. That doesn't necessarily mean everything is fine, as I say with the question marks, and I think this is, don't think of it like this. Don't think of 10 as being like, oh, nothing happens, everything's good. Because something should happen on a move, right? There should be a thing that is successful. Whether that means the player gets what they want, the action that they set out to accomplish, which changes the story, then happens, that's fine. But a better way to think about it is that thinking about every roll introducing a complication, and what the dice say is who gets to introduce the complication and what kind of complication it is. So if we think about it in those terms, the number spread changes from a 6-, the MC introduces a complication that makes things worse for the characters. A 7 to 9, players choose their own complication. Usually this makes things worse, but not necessarily. Sometimes they're choosing their own sort of benefit or complicated, less annoying complication. And then on a 10+, the MC advances the story in a way that offers an opportunity for the characters. This might introduce a complication that they can take advantage of. This is something I've been thinking about a lot because there's been a few conversations about this online, and I've included a little section on this in the forthcoming mission files book for the sprawl, because I think this is a better way of thinking about it than the 10+ meaning success. That the 10+ means that the story changes, and how that changes is advantageous to the characters. So that might mean a complication that they can take advantage of. So if you roll a 10+ when you are checking out the corporate facility, and you see sorry, I just noticed that the label is blocking something. Let me switch that. Okay, if you roll a 10+ when you're checking out the facility, and you see that there's like some big badass enemy of yours there, on a 10+, that should mean that you have some advantage over that enemy. Like the presence of the enemy is in some way advantageous to you, whether you can use that person as an advantage and to distract other guards there, or whether you can have an opportunity to take them out because you see them and can catch them unguarded, that kind of thing. And this is why I say this sort of MC advice, but it's worth keeping in mind for the designer as well. Because part of that bloody fingerprints thing is that you, as the designer, influence all of this stuff at the table in the way that you write your moves. And so you should be aware of that, and you should be thinking about that while you're writing them. What does the way that I've written this move say about the way that I want this to happen in this game, in my game? Because that's the only... you don't get to control how people play your game at the table, but you get to control how the rules are written that will influence how they played at the table. So that's what you get, essentially. So use what you can get. Make the game do what you want it to do out of the box. I feel like I have a duplicate slide in here. Yeah, this is kind of a combination of those, I guess. On a 6-, the MC introduces a complication guided by the MC moves and thus by the designer that makes things worth for the characters. On 7 to 9, players choose their own complication guided by the designer and perhaps mediated by the MC. Perhaps not, depends on the move. And at 10 plus, the MC introduces a complication that offers an opportunity for the characters. Having got this far, I realized that I should have interwoven some examples of these. I wonder if I can really quickly find one in the sprawl and maybe talk about like why it might or might not be good. I mean, maybe assess is good. Okay, let's have a look at this. So, by and large, moves in most Powered by the Apocalypse game, because every designer does it differently. Most of the time I don't list what happens on the 6-, it's just the MC makes a move. The MC, when they get to make a move, introduce a complication that makes things worse. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, not really in need of further explanation. But if I'm wrong, then fire up on the questions. So on a 7 to 9, players choose their own complication guided by the designer and perhaps mediated by the MC. So actually this is not necessarily, well, this is, yes, this is a good example. Although it may not necessarily look like these are complications, they definitely can be. Certainly when I am running the sprawl as a one-shot, and I haven't necessarily prepped a lot for the specific mission, the questions that the players ask can be used to indicate the kind of things they might be interested in dealing with, or the kinds of things they're worrying about that might be interesting to bring in. So when a player asks, what do I notice despite an effort to conceal it, I will often introduce a complication. Not necessarily, and usually it's something that I've had in mind anyway. Or maybe I'll just clue them into a complication, something that already existed and would have been a problem, but now they see it, right? So this is an example of me as the designer giving a framework for the kinds of complications that might come up when you check out to see what kind of situation you're in. Trouble, looking for advantage, biggest threat, this kind of stuff. I can find another example. Oh, and the 10 plus, yeah, it's also not a good example. The 10 plus is just the same again, but as an MC, when I'm running this, on a 10 plus, I will look for these to be really advantageous, and on a 7 to 9, I will look for these to be problematic. That's something that I possibly could have been clearer about in the rules. Play hardball. That's pretty good. On a 10 plus, the MC advances the story in a way that offers an opportunity for the characters. Yep. The players, whatever they want will happen. There might be other consequences of that as well. But the MC is kind of mediating the reactions, knowing what the players have rolled. 7 to 9, players get to choose their own complication, right? And so this is explicitly that, where they're choosing their own complication. But the 10 plus in these kind of situations should definitely be a little bit more advantageous, right? When you roll a 10 plus, you have done better than when you rolled a 7 to 9. So the dice roll should reflect that. Let me just flick back to the slideshow. Okay. Cool. So that's basically what I wanted to say about moves. This is I think this is my last slide here. And it's to reiterate my point about iteration. The root of iteration is the Latin word iter, which means journey or way or path. So iteration is literally the journey that you're taking. So don't be afraid to come back to these, to revise, to go back to the moves, to reconsider them, to go back to agenda, to reconsider them. Always check to make sure that your vision for the game is still on track with the specifics. This is something that I talk about a lot when I'm advising students on like essay writing. That every paragraph should kind of the thesis, advance the main point of the whole paper. And so that is also true of games. I think every mechanic should in some way advance what the main part of the game is about. If you are writing a game about Jane Austen and you find yourself obsessing over rules for sneaking and hiding, you might want to think, well, are these appropriate actually for this genre? And maybe they are. As I said, I'm not a Jane Austen fan. I leave that to the experts. But you as the expert on your game should know what your game is going to be about, and know how to, and be thinking about how each of the parts contribute to that. That's kind of a meta level. So yeah, my final slide here that sums up the three things I sort of talked about. That you should start with the emcee agenda. That's always my first piece of advice. Start with the emcee agenda. Tell the emcee how they're supposed to run the game, because it also will tell you what you should be doing to reinforce that. Right? And the agenda is the most important thing to start thinking about early. Principles will come from that and you'll iterate back. Moves will come from that and you'll iterate back. But the agenda, if you have a strong idea for what your game is about, that should be one of the first things that you can kind of strongly think about. It might not necessarily, there are definitely cases where it won't be, and that's cool. But there's definitely a point in every sort of design conversation I have with someone who's designing games and has reached a stumbling block. Usually that stumbling block is best resolved by going back to what the game is about and focusing on what it does. So that's the first point. Second point, think about player agenda and principles. Third point, understand how moves are structured. And in all of that sort of couched within that early advice about like basic game design stuff, like particularly the one about feedback and iteration, right? And focusing on the thing that your game does well. So that is all that I had to say about this topic. I hope it has been useful. I don't see any chatty type questions. I don't know. Let me ad lib for a little bit, just in case anybody has one. If you have a question, now would be a good time to ask it. Otherwise, this morning I streamed some Rome Total War. My day job is a ancient historian, so I have started playing Rome Total War in a series that I'm calling Carpe Imperium, where I play it and talk about Roman history. I'm playing the Grand Campaign as Rome, as the Cornelia, the Cornelian clan, Gens. So that's fun. Yeah. I don't know exactly when I'll next be streaming that, but that will be sometime. Well, I'm going to try and do that reasonably regularly over the summer break. The other thing that will be happening in terms of streaming is also on this channel I do a show called Cybershock with Kira Margarine, Fraser Simons, and sometimes a couple of other people, Banana Chan and Phil Vecchioni, and that the next one will be happening in a couple of weeks. We were supposed to do that last night, but I had audio troubles with my streaming setup, and I ended up like completely reconfiguring that. Just gonna move this around to here. No, I'm not. That messes with everything. Yeah. Kanye D says this has been tremendously informative, so thank you. I'm glad you got something out of it. Hopefully this will be up on YouTube fairly soon. Hopefully it will be useful for the person who originally requested it, Olivia, so thanks for posing the question. I am always happy to take questions on Twitter, at Peregrine Kiwi. You can also find me at the sprawl_RPG or at Arden's Ludere. But Peregrine Kiwi is the main one. And if you have questions and I'm happy to answer them quickly, I will. And if I think they might involve a little bit more discussion, then I'm happy to do that here. Hopefully this provokes some sort of discussion and some people saying I'm wrong, and then I can do another stream saying why I'm not. But we'll see how that goes. So thanks for watching. And yeah, as I said, this will be up on YouTube soon. And I will see you all next time I take to the skies, I guess. Take to the airwaves. Take to the internets. Until then, good gaming, and happy Pride, everyone.